the most radiologically contaminated site in the Western Hemisphere. Collapse of a tunnel leading to the plutonium-uranium extraction facility, or PUREX site, was discovered earlier today. And even though within minutes of its discovery, our government was assuring people that there was no radiation release, you wonder about the truth of that statement when you hear Bob Alvarez explain about the contents of that tunnel that are now exposed to the air.
These tunnels are so radioactive and they're loaded with such dangerous materials, including ignitable materials, that it's infeasible to go in there and do any inspection without being overexposed to radiation.
When you hear something like that from a former senior policy advisor to the Secretary and Deputy Assistant Secretary for National Security and the Environment, you may suspect that there is more to this story than you have yet been told. And that's how you know that you are in the seat that we all share.
Nuclear hot seat. What are those people thinking? Nuclear hot seat. What have those boys been drinking? Nuclear hot seat. The corium is sinking. Our time to act is shrinking, but our activists are linking. Nuclear hot seat. It's the bomb.
Welcome to Nuclear Hot Seat, the weekly international news magazine keeping you up to date on all things nuclear from a different perspective. My name is Libby Halevi. I am the producer and host, as well as a survivor of the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island from just 1 mile away. So I know what can happen when those nuclear so-called experts get it wrong. This week, our regular program is jettisoned so that we can bring you the latest on this morning's revelation of a major accident at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in southeastern Washington state. Nuclear Hot Seat will have exclusive interviews with nuclear watchdogs, activists, and a certified nutrition educator who offers some radiation protection tips. These individuals, all of them experts in their own right, will offer information on what we know on the current situation at Hanford, and much of what they say contradicts the official narrative. If you live in Washington State, Oregon, or Idaho, and have in the past heard only the tiniest of sound bites, sound nibbles, from citizen watchdog groups for Hanford, fasten your seatbelt for a bumpy ride into nuclear from a truly different perspective. All these interviews were conducted today, Tuesday, May 9, 2017. First, the official story, as reported on the website of King 5 News in Washington State. Hundreds of workers were told to take cover at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation after a tunnel full of highly contaminated materials collapsed on Tuesday. Note this second statement. But officials say no radiation was released and no workers were hurt. We'll return to that thought shortly. Officials say a collapsed patch of ground above the tunnel was larger than first believed. The U.S. Department of Energy said the collapse covered about 400 square feet, 37.1 square meters. Hundreds of workers were told to take cover position after the tunnel in a plutonium-uranium extraction plant, or PUREX plant, collapsed. The agency says the rail tunnels are made of wood and concrete and are hundreds of feet long, with about 8 feet of soil covering them. The U.S. Department of Energy now says the incident caused the soil above the tunnel to sink between 2 and 4 feet. They were originally constructed to hold rail cars that were loaded with contaminated equipment. 8 rail cars are in the tunnel that collapsed, but it feeds into a longer tunnel that contains 28 loaded rail cars. The tunnel collapsed near where the 2 tunnels join. During routine surveillance at 8:29 on Tuesday morning, the agency said it discovered a 20-foot-wide hole in the roof of one of the tunnels. A manager sent a message to all personnel telling them to secure ventilation in your building and refrain from eating or drinking. Take cover status was expanded to the entire site at 10:35 a.m., 2 hours after discovery. It is believed that crews doing road work nearby may have created enough vibration to cause the collapse. Robots were being used to determine possible air contamination. Washington Governor Jay Inslee said the state is monitoring the air quality independently from federal authorities. Hanford, which is roughly half the size of Rhode Island, spent decades making plutonium for the nation's nuclear weapons arsenal. So that's the official story as it stands. Yet, while officials quickly reassured the media, and thus the public, that no radiation had been released, there are many who believe that this rush to reassurance was not based on science, but rather PR and the need to manage panic. Nuclear Hotseat has a long history of covering events at the Hanford site. To find out more about the Purex facility and these tunnels, we spoke first with Bob Alvarez. Bob is a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he is currently focused on nuclear disarmament, environmental, and energy policies. At the U.S. Department of Energy, he served as a senior policy advisor to the Secretary and Deputy Assistant Secretary for National Security and the Environment from 1993 to 1999. He has a long resume, but here's one for you. In 1975, Bob Alvarez helped found and direct the Environmental Policy Institute, a respected national public interest organization, and he also helped organize a successful lawsuit on behalf of the family of Karen Silkwood, a nuclear worker and active union member who was killed under mysterious circumstances in 1974. Bob filled us in on the background of the Purex site and this tunnel.
Bob, thanks for joining us on such short notice. Explain to us the history of that particular section of the site as you understand it and the implications of today's known tunnel collapse.
That part of the site is where they operated the plants that essentially separated plutonium and uranium from spent fuel and then generated large amounts of what's called high-level radioactive waste that are stored in these large underground tanks at Hanford. And the facility that they're talking about is called the Purex plant, plutonium uranium extraction plant. And the way this worked is that the Hanford site was at one time the largest integrated nuclear production site in the world. And they had about 9 reactors operating along the river. Columbia River runs through the site, where they would irradiate uranium and then until such time as enough plutonium was built up, and then eventually they would haul this highly radioactive spent fuel in remote-controlled trains to the center of the site, where they would go into these tunnels where they would take out the spent fuel, and then the spent fuel would then be dissolved in acid, and then they would use solvents to recover the plutonium, and the waste would be generated. So when the plant closed down, the tunnels were so highly radioactive because a lot of the train cars became contaminated, and they also began to store lots of contaminated stuff there that they never gave it much thought. And so these tunnels are so radioactive, and they're loaded with such dangerous materials, including ignitable materials, that it's infeasible to go in there and do any inspection without being overexposed to radiation. The tunnel that I think that collapsed is probably tunnel number 1, because it's the only one that was reinforced with timber. The other tunnels were reinforced with concrete. So I suspect that there was some sort of subsidence event. These tunnels have rail beds going into them, and so there's a lot of weight. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was a subsidence on the rail bed that caused collapse, and also the timber might have been rotting away. This is one of the places at the site where it's going to prove to be extremely dangerous and very, very difficult to come to terms with.
One of the reports that I've heard talked about the fact that there was some construction going on in the area, and they suspected that vibrations from that may have weakened the timbers in the tunnels.
Well, the timbers were put in there in the early 1950s, so that doesn't surprise me. And the other thing about that part of the site is that they were over a period of many years, they were pouring a lot of liquids into the ground as they were processing this spent fuel, and so they created a rather unstable situation in terms of the near surface. So it doesn't surprise me that you had construction activities going nearby that probably destabilized the supports on the tunnels. The problem is now that you have this collapse, what does that mean in terms of stirring things up, and how dangerous have they created an additional hazard that we now have to be mindful of? This is one of these parts of the site that has been largely forgotten, and it's out of sight, out of mind. And one of the things about Hanford is that it's really a surprise if there are no surprises there.
Bob, as regards radiation, I know that there are a very small number of radiation monitors, 2 or 3 for the state, and we don't know how close any monitors are from the EPA to this particular area on the Hanford site. Yet, one of my contacts told me that the current reading that is up shows a spike that is over 300. Would that be something that raises alarm bells?
I'm not sure what the 300 number means. Is it 300 millirems? Is it 300 Rankins? It's possible that radiation might have escaped into the open environment because of this collapse, which would be a real problem because you don't want anybody nearby. This stuff could resuspend. It probably has plutonium in it and other perhaps fission products. But one thing I do know is that people don't dare go in these tunnels because it would pose a life-threatening hazard to go into them.
I see that you posted on Facebook that some of the material contained was ignitable waste. What does that consist of, and what does that mean?
Usually they were handling a lot of solvents. The solvents like tributyl-phosphate or kerosene were being used to extract the plutonium and uranium from the spent fuel after it was dissolved in nitric acid. So there are probably solvents there. There may be organic vapors coming off into the air, but you see, these tunnels are so radioactive that you just can't send anybody in there to figure out what to do.
I also saw that they were sending in a robot to try and figure this out. Any sense of what that might be able to accomplish?
Well, they have these remote-controlled devices they can send in that have cameras on them that probably can collect information such as how much radiation might be in the air, what also might be present in terms of radiation dose rates, what other vapors there might be. This tunnel is not comparable, let's say, to the meltdown of Fukushima, where the remote control instruments are just destroyed because the radiation levels are so high. The radiation levels are not that high, but they're high enough to pose life-threatening hazards to human beings. So for robots, they'll be able to determine a certain amount of information, especially visual information, and maybe collecting air samples and measuring radiation levels to be able to understand what's happening. Like I say, I think this is it has 2 types of hazards here. One is the potential for escape of the radioactive and other toxic materials to the environment, which is most primarily a risk to nearby workers. And the other more significant danger over time is trying to go in there and clean that place up.
It's still early days to figure this out, but how would an accident of this sort compare to the one that happened at the waste isolation pilot plant in 2014?
Well, I mean, the waste isolation pilot plant really has some parallels to this, but this is something different. The waste isolation pilot plant is a geologic repository, a salt mine that was designed and has been storing plutonium-contaminated waste, and they had a real failure, a breakdown of the safety culture there that led to a barrel or 2 exploding or having a deflagration event. This is something that happened as a result of just aging, deterioration, and neglect, where they were storing large amounts of contaminated material. They kind of forgot about it or put it at the bottom of the list of things to do, and now it's turned into a big problem.
That was Bob Alvarez, Senior Scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies. You may not be aware of the fact that many nuclear activists around the country, indeed around the world, work together when a big story breaks to learn what we can before official lines of communication choke off alternative voices and sources. These are the people I rely upon. One of the most reliable sources for understanding EPA radiation charts is Radiation Watch, a private group which checks readings and communicates when there are problems which have not made it into the news. I spoke with Julie Wert, researcher and member of Radiation Watch, to learn more about what we knew regarding possible radiation releases. She came up with at least 2 shocking bits of information. She explained a bit about how the group functions to get this material, with a reference to Erica Gray, who provides all of the material from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that I use every week for the Nuclear Reactor Duck and Cover Report.
Erica pulls the NRC reports, and I usually just try and see, according to the status reports, what the radiation levels are in the different areas that's being posted. I pull graphs according to the levels of radiation that are coming out of these plants when they close down or when they have radiation releases.
What do we know about the situation at Hanford?
From what I'm seeing, there is an emergency declared there because they have had a collapse. Now, that radiation is high-level radiation, cesium and plutonium. If that's getting out into the atmosphere, that's pretty devastating for all of us.
Is that showing up on any of the charts yet?
Well, I pulled the one from Hanford, and it's showing high spikes. It's getting up there in the high spikes. The gamma-5 radiation is from reactors. It's supposed to be censored for nuclear power. So that's why I always pull the gamma-5.
The gamma-5 relates to the hot fuel rods that are being transported through this particular tunnel. When you say the levels are high, what is the reading, and explain to us what that means? What would be a normal or a safe reading, and what are these showing?
Well, a safe reading is way below 100. They tell us that anything above 100, you should get out of the area, or 150. This is going way up over 300. So that indicates that there is some releases going on. This is hard because the thing of it is that it goes through the wind, and this is how these monitors pick it up, through the wind. So it all depends on wind direction as far as these accuracy on these monitors.
If you know, how many monitors are there, and how close are they to the site that we are concerned about?
That is something I need to check in on. There's 2 or 3 per state.
Stop right there. Only 2 or 3 monitors per state?
Exactly, yes. Not enough. Not enough at all. And a lot of times they're not really close to the nuclear power plants. Some of them are, there's not enough of them for one thing. And it depends on the state, but and it all depends on the wind. So yeah, we could use more. Because if the wind is going in the other direction from where the monitor is, it's not going to pick it up.
So in other words, with this spike, this current spike, showing over 300, how current was that reading?
RadNet only posts every hour. So I'm Eastern Standard Time, so when they post them, they're Eastern Time. So the last one that they posted was for 259 CPMs, and that was 1649.
Well, 1649 would be 4:49 p.m., and that clearly would indicate yesterday as opposed to a post from today.
Well, they posted it today because the date is 5/9. We only have the information on what they tell us. These monitors are RadNet, EPA RadNet.
Julie, please stay in touch with us, and if you see those numbers going up or going down, if you see any significant change at all, please let us know so I can include that in this report on Nuclear Hot Seat.
The best thing for me to do would be to do one again tonight, and then tomorrow morning we'll see a lot better on what's going on.
If we do not receive that material in time to include in this report, It will be on next week's Nuclear Hot Seat number 308. That was Julie Wert of Radiation Watch. So here we have a mystery. There was an EPA-recorded gamma-5 radiation spike the day before the tunnel collapse at Hanford in the afternoon of Monday, May 8th. And that's with, as you heard my shocked response, only one EPA monitor for the entire site. So that raises questions. Did the accident possibly start unnoticed the day before? Was there at least an overnight period of time when there could have been radiation releases happening without the awareness of officials? And if that EPA monitor is located upwind or sidewind, don't know a better way to refer to it, to the side of the reactor, was the reading perhaps inaccurate, registering lower than the actual radiation released? We'll have some educated conjecture on what that could mean in a little while. To fill in the picture of the overall situation at Hanford, its history and the range of problems there, I next spoke with Chuck Johnson. He is the Nuclear Power Task Force Director for the joint Oregon-Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, or PSR. Ironically, I caught up with Chuck as he was lobbying against Oregon funding a new generation of nuclear reactors.
Chuck Johnson, it's great that we were able to connect for today's Nuclear Hot Seat.
Yeah, what a weird day, Thank you for contacting me about it. I was down here lobbying against the nuclear power industry in Salem, Oregon. They're trying to get permission to build small modular reactors here. And this accident occurred at Hanford, so I appreciate you getting a hold of me.
We're at the other end of the fuel chain when we talk about the problem at Hanford. What is your understanding of what the situation is right now as of 1:30 in the afternoon Pacific time?
Well, the latest that I've seen, King 5, Susanna Frame has been tweeting, and I think you're watching that as well.
Yes,
but
I am.
The latest that I've seen is that they're now allowing, they were having everyone on virtually the entire site to sort of shelter in place until they got a sense of where the contamination was, and they now are letting people move around in the other areas that are away from where the accident occurred. But they're telling people not to eat food still.
That's still in place. From your perspective, what are the problems at Hanford? Briefly, I know we can go on for several days nonstop about this, but what are some of the problems and what makes this such a dangerous situation?
Hanford is the biggest waste cleanup site for nuclear material in the Western Hemisphere. The only other sites that are similar to it are in the former Soviet Union. And it's the result of decades of nuclear weapons production. The creation of plutonium in reactors along the Columbia River. The spent fuel was taken from the reactors that were operated and put into facilities similar to the one that's had this problem that happened today, and including this one, the Purex plant, to extract the plutonium and uranium for nuclear weapons making. That's what Purex stands for, is Plutonium Uranium Extraction Plant. And this is just one of many sites around the Hanford Nuclear Reservation that are contaminated, heavily contaminated with extremely dangerous and long-lived radioactive waste, and also a number of toxic chemicals. It's a very complicated site to clean up, and they're anticipating it'll take till well past 2050 to finish cleanup on site, and that's probably optimistic.
Give us a sense of how extensive the problems are at Hanford, not just this particular site with the tunnels, but what are some of the other difficulties so we understand the magnitude of the situation there?
Well, one of the really interesting things about this is that right now in the discussion about commercial nuclear reactors and some people promoting a revival of commercial nuclear power, there's a discussion that radioactive waste that comes out of these nuclear reactors, the spent nuclear fuel, should not necessarily be considered waste because we can, quote, recycle it, end quote, and take out the plutonium and the uranium to run as additional fuel.
What's wrong with that picture?
Hanford. And we've been doing that at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation for decades. And the kinds of problems that they're facing are exactly what you would expect to face when you take highly irradiated spent nuclear fuel with hundreds of isotopes of radioactive material and elements, and using toxic chemicals strip out the plutonium from the rest of the material. You're left with a toxic sludge that includes cesium, strontium, and a number of other extremely hazardous radioactive materials that are also very hot physically and hot radioactively that you then have to deal with. And at Hanford, you have 177 underground tanks of this toxic goo with these radioactive materials in it that they are hoping one day to solidify into some sort of ceramic or glass logs that they would then put deep in the ground and hope would not get disturbed or somehow get out into the environment. The amount of technical difficulty in doing this has so far stumped them. They have built a large waste vitrification plant to attempt to solidify this liquid tank waste, and then were interrupted in completing it by whistleblowers who pointed out that you could have explosions of hydrogen gas within this system, or even criticality accidents in which spontaneously some of this material would start to split apart radioactively and cause an explosion of radioactive material in that way.
Would that be the same as it going into a nuclear reaction?
Yeah.
So in other words, a bomb on the ground.
Yes. It wouldn't have the same explosive force, but it would kick up this material into the environment and spread extremely dangerous radioactive material into the surrounding community.
What, if anything, do you know about the nature of the materials that were either stored or transported through these tunnels?
The tunnels were used to take the used fuel rods from the reactors along the river to, in this case, the Purex plutonium-uranium extraction plant. And they call these facilities, these plants, these extraction plants, canyon, because they put the waste in at one end along with solvents to break it apart. And then they go through a series of sluices and processes to separate out the different elements. And then at the end of the canyon, they have what they've been seeking to separate out. In this case, it would be plutonium for nuclear weapons.
How efficient is that process, to the best of our knowledge?
You mean how much do they get all the plutonium out, or?
Right. I mean, do they separate it out, or we're still left with radioactive debris?
You're left with radioactive debris. You're left with. They set it up so that they can pull out the elements they want. They can be adjusted to pull out different elements. They can run it to pull out uranium. They can run it to pull out different isotopes of uranium. You can run it to pull out plutonium. I believe they've run these canyons before to pull out strontium and cesium as well. In fact, there's a facility that has cesium and strontium capsules in a below-ground pool of water. They ran the tank waste through the canyons again in order to pull out the cesium and strontium to make the tank waste a little less hot and more easy to handle. And unfortunately, this pool is actually now a hazard as well, because it could crack. And in an earthquake, if the water drained away, it would be so hot that it would become aerosol and spread those deadly radioactive materials throughout the Hanford Reservation as well. So there's a whole series of hazards there at the plant.
One of the concerns that certainly I have raised is that there aren't enough monitors in the area to determine whether radiation has been released, and if so, in what level, because there's wind direction, there are all kinds of variables. Do you know how many monitors the EPA or any other arm of the government has placed around the Hanford site, and do you believe this number is adequate?
I don't know that, and it's something that I need to find out more about. I know that the EPA has a monitoring station on the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. But as you say, I think it might be just in one location. I don't think they try to systematically monitor the entire reservation. But there are a series of EPA radiation monitoring devices throughout the United States, and this is one of the places that they have a station, which is fortunate for us because we will get some reading, but I'm not certain what kind of devices they have around the Hanford reservation. I would be very surprised if the U.S. Department of Energy doesn't have some itself. Last year, I was appointed to the Hanford Advisory Board. This is one of the things I'm going to be asking them about at our next meeting in June, is what kind of monitoring do they have, real-time monitoring, and how can we get this out to the public so that they can know what's going on.
What is the significance of the fact that among the immediate responses to this emergency for the workers on site is that they were locked down inside of buildings, and also they were told not to eat and not to drink?
What that says is that they believe there's a good chance that some radioactive particles were released as a result of this collapse. And the initial lockdown was over a wide area of Hanford. So that's pretty serious. And the reason they would have the lockdown is to keep people from going outside and breathing the air and somehow maybe ingesting into their lungs a hot particle that could cause health problems later on. I understand they're still telling people not to eat and drink. They've let some people off lockdown, but in the areas closest to where the accident occurred, there are still people in lockdown. But they're telling everyone not to eat and drink, and that, of course, is because these particles can find their way onto food and into water, and you just wouldn't want to create the pathway down into your digestive system for these radioactive particles. So this is obviously pretty serious. The U.S. Department of Energy doesn't want the bad public relations that they're getting over this right now, and so they obviously must think this is a serious enough threat to their workers that they have to do it.
Public relations should be the last thing on their mind right now, and the safety of the workers, and beyond that, the safety of the Tri-Cities area, and also beyond that, anyone who's growing food or harvesting fish, or the health of the Columbia River. All of this is up for grabs right now.
Yeah, they're saying that people outside of the Hanford Reservation don't need to worry, but obviously the radioactive particles don't know where the boundary lines are, and I'm not sure which way the wind is blowing and how hard it's blowing. So that would be something to figure out and know. Get back to that monitoring thing, too, that you were talking about, is you really, obviously, these types of accidents occur, and these types of releases occur, and so we really ought to have access to information about what's coming off the site at Hanford.
Magical thinking of the nuclear industry as regards if you're off-site, you don't have to worry, reminds me
of an old cartoon
where it showed people traveling across the country, and they're in this horrible windstorm and snowstorm, and they get to the border of California, and they cross the border, and suddenly it's sunshine and warm.
Yeah.
And I think that's the best explanation of how they want us to deal with this, where, of course, we know that the potential, we're not saying that it has happened, but the potential, and there is a spike that showed up on the chart as of the one that was brought to my attention this morning. So let's stay in touch, and if you get any further information, certainly let me know. We will be covering this as a special today, and I will have follow-up stories next week as they are appropriate.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm really glad that you alerted me to this. Everybody else did almost simultaneously, and it's helping us kill this small modular reactor bill they're trying to pass in the Oregon legislature, right? And we're going to win. This was like just the timing was really good.
I don't know that anyone can say the timing is ever good on a nuclear accident, but at least there's some good to be gotten from it. Chuck Johnson, thanks so much for being available for this interview at last minute, and keep us informed of any changes that are taking place at Hanford.
All right, I will. Thank you for staying on top of this.
Chuck Johnson of the Oregon-Washington Joint Physicians for Social Responsibility. We'll have a link up on our site to Nuclear Hot Seat number 195, where I conducted a more extensive interview with Chuck Johnson on Hanford's many problems. There will also be links on the site to other interviews dealing specifically with Hanford, so you can get a sense of the history of what's been happening on that site. They will all be up on nuclearhotseat.com under this episode, number 307. We'll have more information you won't find on mainstream media about the Hanford emergency tunnel collapse, as well as information on nutritional ways to help protect your body from exposure to nuclear radiation. But first, I want you to understand that what you are hearing is one of the few programs to regularly counter the mainstream media nuclear industry programmed narrative that nuclear is good, we can't survive without it, blah, blah, blah. Every week, Nuclear Hot Seat interviews the counter voices, the verifiable experts with footnotes and peer-reviewed papers, serious credentials, and ferocious activism in their background, to give you a different look at the deeply entrenched nuclear establishment. As longtime activist Harvey Wasserman of Solartopia once said to me, the thing about opposing nuclear is that the pay is lousy, but the hours are good. Actually, there is no pay. Nuclear Hot Seat is my labor of love and activism and passion to communicate the stories that you would otherwise not know about. I get no salary, take no ads, and there are many who think I'm stupid to do all this work for what they perceive as nothing. But the way I do it allows me to keep the show clean and free from outside influence. What I do ask is if you feel you have gotten value from this show and want to support its future and my dedication to getting you verifiable alternative perspectives on nuclear issues, please send a donation. Any amount is welcomed with deep gratitude. We're coming up on the 6th anniversary of the start of Nuclear Hot Seat, so how about a symbolic $6 donation? You can make it a sustaining donation of $6 a month. Or send something else, something that best represents your appreciation for the work that goes into the making of this weekly information package. To donate, just go to nuclearhotseat.com and click on the big red donate button. Whatever you can do to help us meet our expenses and hopefully expand the show and the website's functionality, I thank you. Now back to this week's Nuclear Hot Seat number 307, the Hanford Emergency Special. One of my favorite anti-nuclear firebrands is Mimi Gurman of No Nukes Northwest and radcast.org. Radcast, which Mimi helped to found, provides citizen monitoring of radiation levels around the country. Mimi is filled with strong opinions, sharp observations, and a logic that has been missing regarding our examination of what's happening at the Hanford site and the possible severity of the current accident. Give a listen to a genuinely powerful and passionate woman.
I'm talking with Mimi Gurman of Radcast and No Nukes Northwest. And Mimi, you've been involved with both Hanford issues and also radiation monitoring issues for a long time now. First of all, what is your opinion of the adequacy or lack thereof of the
radiation monitoring system at
Hanford site in Washington State?
Hanford has been completely inadequate regarding any form of monitoring radiation, probably since the very beginning of Hanford's days. I believe that it was made this way so that even the people who work there aren't as concerned as they should be in working there due to the high levels of radiation that come out of different areas of the site on any given day. We don't know about this or hear about this for that very reason. There's only one EPA monitor at the Hanford site. I don't know exactly where it is because, again, we're not supposed to know exactly where it is. And we do know it exists. We also know that the EPA, under the Obama presidency, would turn off the monitoring system on any particular whim And a whim in the case of Hanford means a radiological leak. So, knowing that, there is no adequacy regarding understanding the level, the deep level of radiological leaks at Hanford. Regarding what happened this morning, or more than likely last night, as we know due to graph intake that we received from a friend, part of our team, Julie Wert, we know last night there was a spike in gamma-5 on the Hanford for EPA site.
And explain what gamma-5 is and why we should be alarmed about it.
We know that gamma-5 tells us what is happening with radiological waste. So nuclear plant, nuclear waste sites, this kind of thing would be something that we would see in gamma-5 as opposed to like X-ray, which would be more of gamma-2. So there was a spike last night, which could mean that the collapse was beginning to happen. It could mean that it did happen and it wasn't detected till this morning. We won't know until either somebody says or, they don't know. So that's an unknown. There are a lot of unknowns, and this is part of the problem with the nuclear cartel. They work best receiving money when we don't know what it is they are actually doing. The nuclear cartel is Hanford, it's the contractors, Bechtel, CH2M Hill, those are the primary. It used to be DuPont, GE, all of these corporations are part of the nuclear cartel, and they're really good at getting money for themselves out of the military machine. So the military is always going to give Hanford money to the tune of $2 billion a year, and that money is designated to the contractors for cleanup. Cleanup rarely happens at Hanford, at the Hanford site, and this is a site that was posted for remediation, Site 200, where this collapse happened, and yet it still hasn't been remediated after decades. They knew decades ago for this particular site, for these trains, for these two tunnels, that they were getting so hot that these sites needed to be shut down. So they were, and they were covered in earth. And there were also wood beams to, keep the stability. For whatever reason, and I have a conjecture on what the reason was, there was a collapse. Some people today attributed the collapse to people doing construction work on a road nearby. That could be from the vibration, but it could also, and probably was, also due to high radiation levels inside causing instability to the earth itself that was maintaining a structure over the trains, over the radiation that was present inside the tunnels. So as soon as the collapse happened, radiation came out of the tunnel that was kept inside the tunnel and in the dust of the soils, so went airborne. Now, we don't know yet what was released. We don't know the type of radioactivity that was released. We don't know if it was alpha particles. We have no idea yet. They won't tell us. Do I think they know? Yes, I do. Why do I think they know? Because they brought a robot in today. Why did they bring in a robot to do testing? Because it was so hot, I believe, that they needed a robot in that place, on that site, instead of a human, to find out the high levels of radiation that they already knew existed from their dosimeters. Everybody at Hanford has a dosimeter. So the only way that they knew to evacuate people is because they knew that the radiation levels were high. These are things they won't tell you. They'll tell you there was no radiation release. That's what the media says.
That was the first information that came out less than an hour after the announcement. There was an official announcement that said no radiation leak, which of course was ridiculous because there's no way they could know that yet.
That's exactly right. It's not even that they didn't know that. They knew the opposite. And that's why the evacuation happened. And that's why on Site 200, people were still, at the end of the day, still in lockdown, while others were able to leave the area. So if there was no radiation, everybody would have been able to leave. The only reason they can keep people inside for their own safety is because they have the answer to that little riddle, which is, how do we know they should be inside? Because we know what the numbers are of the radiation. But you and I don't know what those numbers are. Do they? Absolutely. Every single person who was in there knows what these numbers are. They know what the robot detected. They know if the robot detected particles or what else. We don't know this data. This is the same thing that happened at Fukushima. Not the accident, but I mean this deference of truth for PR so that the company looks okay, so that they can then go back to the government, the military, and say, look, we need more money for more robots.
Right, but they'll get more robots. They won't get more monitors because that would just expose them to further truth about what's going on here.
One of the things in one of the articles today that they said was, as you watch the outline of what went down today, they brought in hazmat. Hazmat was on the perimeter. Then they had to bring in monitors, and they set monitors up. So clearly they need monitors at Hanford, but they won't put monitors at Hanford for the very reason that you just said, which is, why would anybody want to know who works there, first of all, because nobody would work there. And secondly, if we had access to more information for what the radiation was, then we would know how bad Hanford was on the outside. The public would know.
You are involved with RADCAST, which is a citizen monitoring network. Do we have any citizen monitoring people on the perimeter of Hanford, or people who can get in sight and set up a monitoring, or just drive by or walk by or whatever they need to do to get readings? Do we have people on the ground?
We used to have people on the ground, and they moved. We knew who they were. We visited with them, and the woman, the mother, wanted to get out, wanted to get her kids out, and so they found work elsewhere and left, and I was very happy that they left. In the meantime, we have no Geiger counter citizen monitors there. I did get in touch with someone today who does live out there, and I asked him if he wanted me to locate a monitor for him, and I would mail that to him. Though, I have to say, right now, it's a very dangerous time there. What I want him to do, if he'll do this, and if I can get a monitor for him, is just do it from his house, since he's still living there. But I don't want him to go closer to Hanford. It's very dangerous right now.
Mimi, we will follow up with you in the coming weeks to get other reports on what you see as coming out of Hanford. But for now, what final thought do you want to leave us with in this not resolved, not settled situation at the Hanford nuclear reservation?
First of all, we need the truth. Getting the truth from the nuclear corporation is extremely difficult. It took Fukushima 2.5 years to release one piece of semi-truth data regarding how hot things were at the time of the meltdown. I'm hoping that we can get the truth by pressuring senators, congresspeople of both Oregon and Washington, and if listeners are in Idaho, call yours as well, and demand that we get true facts about what's going on here. I don't think that people will give us those facts. I don't think that the congresspeople have those facts unless they're on special committees. It's so secretive. But that's what we need.
When last I checked, and we're talking at 6:45 in the evening, when last I checked, all personnel from Hanford had been sent home except those who were in proximity and needed for the cleanup at this particular site. At least that's what they were saying. So in terms of having been locked down and then leaving the site, if you want to call that an evacuation, we can call that an evacuation. That has now entailed everyone except essential personnel to deal with this event.
That's what I heard as well, which leaves me with another question, or another conjecture, really, that if the warning that went out, or the word that went out from that, the notice that went out from that, is that no non-essential personnel can come back to work tonight. Again, when those notices go out that way, we have to understand what they're saying is that there is radioactivity there and it isn't safe for other people, and they don't know what to expect. They don't know if more of the collapsed whole is going to expand. Nobody's talking about that. So there's more to this that's going to unfold as the hours go by, and we really need the truth for what's happening. As far as my main concern is, what are the radiological numbers? I want to know measurement, because that tells us how people are being harmed, not just at Hanford, not just at the Columbia Generating Station, but in the community at large.
Mimi, I so appreciate your acuity, your expertise, and your passion about the issues, and we will stay in touch as we learn more about what is happening at Hanford.
Thank you for all your work.
Mimi Gurman of No Nukes Northwest, and radcast.org. Best way to contact her is through No Nukes Northwest on Facebook. And now health, the final frontier. Kimberly Roberson is founder of Fukushima Fallout Awareness Network, FFAN, which concerns itself with food and water safety in the wake of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. She's a certified nutrition educator, the author of Silence Deafening, Fukushima Fallout, A Mother's Response, and a regular source for Nuclear Hotseat. Full disclosure, Kimberly and I researched and produced Radiation Awareness Protection Talk, an audio series that goes over various ways to protect one's health, family, home, garden, even pets from radiation exposure. Kimberly Roberson.
Kim, given the situation in Hanford and not knowing yet the extent to which the workers may have been exposed to radiation, for those individuals either working on site or in proximity with it, what are some of the things they can do to protect themselves from radiation?
Hi, Libby. Well, that's a great question. And some of the things that I've been recommending are actually very simple to do. For instance, and this might seem too simple for many people, but a multivitamin and mineral supplement, a high-quality one, not something that you'd buy at a big chain store that's hard tablets that have a hard time digesting, but a good quality brand you'd find at a health food store in capsule form, which is not just a vitamin, but multivitamin and mineral supplement, emphasis on the minerals. When we have sufficient supplies of minerals in our system, it helps to block some of the radionuclides from coming in to our bodies. So that's a good one that everybody should be doing anyway. Another one to keep on hand would be spirulina, purified zeolite tincture, vitamin C, which is incredibly powerful as an antioxidant, apple pectin fiber, fresh garlic, and chlorella too. Chlorella and spirulina have both had many studies backing their power with helping to not only block radiation but remove it from the body. So I think it's stronger with removing once it's there. So those are some things to do. Also, always be aware that you research the source, call the company, find out whatever you can online. For instance, there are some multivitamin and mineral supplements that people could give kids. If you look on the label, you'll find that the potassium iodide is being sourced from kelp, for instance, or the omega-3s are coming from fish when we don't know where the fish is coming from. So those are concentrations that you really don't need in your system of things that could be really bad.
Right, because that could be contaminated from the radiation that's coming from Fukushima.
That's right. And water is very important to filter as well. And when you and I were doing some research, we came across a company called Zero Water, which I think is probably the best commercial pitcher out there on the market. Their filters are kind of like a reverse osmosis type system. And in addition to removing so many contaminants, even radioactive ones, it removes healthy minerals, so you have to be sure to take that multivitamin and mineral supplement.
What about the assumption that people have, something radioactive just happened, I need to take potassium iodide?
Well, that could be an overreaction depending on the situation. Now, I know you've done some programs on this in the past, Libby, and if it's not an actual event with an explosion, I don't think it's necessary to take the potassium iodide. Is that right?
My understanding is that because the radioactive iodine has such a relatively short half-life, they'll say 8 days, that extrapolates out to 10 half-life cycles, which is 80 days, so say 3 months. But that's only coming off a fresh nuclear accident. This is a radioactive accident because it's not dealing with a chain reaction that is currently happening. So potassium iodide is not, to my understanding, anything that would be of assistance at this time.
Right. I wanted to say, too, Libby, that I couldn't help but think that this is yet another opportunity for us to really take a hard look at the food that's grown in the region around Hanford, because it's really astonishing when you look into it how much food is produced in that region near these leaking radioactive tanks and the river that the radiation migrates to. You know, anything from potatoes to cattle, a multitude of fruits, including wine, you know, vineyards. In that area is one of the largest wine regions in Washington State.
And to say nothing of the fish in the Columbia River, which is adjacent to the Hanford site, and also Columbia Generating Station, which is right there. So there is most likely radioactivity, radionuclides that are going downriver. And I remember from one of my previous reports that while the water might register as being relatively clean, that the radioactive elements over time have fallen to the bottom of the river and are trapped in the mud and the silt down there. So there are higher levels of radiation than may show up just by checking out surface water. It sounds like there are things people can do to at least somewhat protect their health as best possible from radiation that may be coming out, and we're still checking to find out any readings that we can trust at this point to tell us if radioactivity has been released from Hanford.
Great. Well, I'm really glad that you're following the story. It's so important. And, you know, I wanted to mention one more thing about even when we're past this, if there is a past point, please, listeners, keep in mind the food that's grown in that region. There's even a very reputable organic food company. They've been growing there since the early 70s, and their food is on shelves from Walmart to Costco to health food stores, you name it. It kind of pains me to even bring this up because obviously they're trying to do the right thing, but they're situated 100 miles away from Hanford. We really have to ask these really hard questions and be super vigilant over what we put in our bodies, ask these companies tough questions, and whenever possible, source from other places. I really would recommend that. And that includes fish, seafood from the Pacific, and even if you looked at fish from the Atlantic Ocean, you've got Sellafield, nuclear disaster off the coast of Ireland. You have Chernobyl fallout that's still in the environment around Norway and in those waters. So really, the only solution is to shut them down, and hopefully this information will help that process. But until then, following the steps that I mentioned earlier on when we were talking would definitely be helpful, I think.
Kimberly Roberson. We will link to Fukushima Fallout Awareness Network, and if you wish to learn more about ways to protect your health and the health of your loved ones from radiation in all possible ways, go to the program Kimberly and I created, RAPTawareness.com. It stands for Radiation Awareness Protection Talk, R-A-P like Peter, T like Tom, awareness.com. This has been your Nuclear Hotseat for Tuesday, May 9, 2017. This episode is built upon the shoulders of ace investigative reporter Susanna Frame of King 5 News in Seattle. Susanna is the only broadcast reporter in the entire country assigned to a nuclear beat. Her years of award-winning coverage of Hanford showed yet again in her acuity, precision, speed, quality, and the nature of her sources in covering this emergency. If you want to know the latest breaking from Hanford, I urge you to follow her on Twitter at sframek5. And I had the privilege of interviewing Susanna for Nuclear Hotseat number 109 from July 16, 2013. There will be a link up to that on the website as well. In addition to the activist thank so far within the program, I wish to acknowledge Nancy Faust of Simply Info and Deb Reed of Radiation Watch for their assistance. And my apologies to Sean McGee, Nuclear Hotseat's European correspondent, who filed his audio report just before we found out about Hanford. We'll catch up with his news next week. If you have a story lead, a hot tip, or a suggestion of someone to interview, send an email to info@nuclearhotseat.com. We are copyright 2017, Libby Halevi and Heartistry Communications. All rights reserved, but fair use allowed as long as proper attribution is provided. And even if you're counterpunch, proper attribution consists of my name and the name Nuclear Hotseat. And a reminder that if you appreciate weekly verifiable news updates about nuclear issues around the world, delivered with as much humor as possible, though it's been absent from today's report, Take a moment to send a supporting donation to nuclearhotseat.com and sign up for our weekly email, which gives you a link to each week's program. That's the yellow box on the Nuclear Hot Seat website. This is Libby Halevi of Heartistry Communications, the heart of the art of communicating, reminding you that we've all had our nuclear wake-up call. So don't go back to sleep, because we are all in the Nuclear Hot Seat.